Hi, I am Rebecca. I am the psych coach, and today I'm going to be talking to you about cognitive behavioural therapy, or CBT as it's more popularly known. Cognitive behavioural therapy is a really popular treatment for lots of conditions like anxiety, depression. It can be used to help people with their self-worth and self-esteem. It's become really popular, and a lot of people are able to do some cognitive behavioural therapy techniques on themselves. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about what CBT is, how it can help you, and what you can do to apply some of the principles of cognitive behavioural therapy to yourself in order for you to reap the benefits of it and for you to ultimately feel better in your day-to-day life. So, cognitive behavioural therapy is based on the premise that the way you think affects how you feel and how you behave. For example, if you tell yourself, I'm no good, I'm useless, that is going to affect how you feel, isn't it? It's going to make you feel pretty down, and it's going to affect how you behave. You're probably going to avoid things. You're not going to put yourself forward for things. You may not meet new people. So the way you think affects how you feel and how you behave. But the way you behave also affects how you feel emotionally and how you think. For example, if you continually avoid situations, which is a behaviour, and you don't engage with the world around you and the people around you, if you continually avoid that, then that fuels your thought processes of, I don't want to engage in the world outside, the world is too scary, people aren't very nice. And so it becomes a mutually affecting cycle where the way you behave affects how you think, and then the way you think affects how you behave. And both of those influence how you feel. The aim of cognitive behavioural therapy is not to undermine difficulty. Neither is its job to make you feel better about negative situations. If someone's going through a really intense breakup and they've just lost their job, it would be really very wrong and unhelpful to say, well, just think about it in a more positive way and you'll feel more positive. Absolutely not. If someone's going through adversity, no matter how you spin it, it's adversity. But cognitive behavioural therapy tries to focus on enhancing our resilience, recognising our ability to cope. But it is not to be confused with positive thinking, nor is it to be confused with the idea that you're just trying to make a bad situation better or a bad situation a positive one. That's simply not the case. The way we think is heavily influenced by our early life experiences. It's pretty widely accepted that the relationships we have with those around us when we're growing up, the environment that we're brought up in, what we're exposed to from a young age, really has an impact on how we function as adults. In fact, in most areas of psychology, that's pretty widely accepted that early life experiences influence how we are. In cognitive behavioural therapy, the theory is that if you experience certain early childhood experiences, such as, maybe rejection or abandonment or lots of conflict, that will fuel shape some fundamental ways of thinking about yourself, about the world, and about other people in it. If, for example, you're brought up with an insecure attachment to a main caregiver, or you're constantly ignored or neglected, it may be that you have a sense of self that isn't particularly robust, that maybe you have what we would call a core belief of, I'm not worthy or I'm not lovable. And as a child, of course, you're not going to sit there thinking, wow, this has happened to me and this is the way I'm going to process it and this is going to be my core belief that will see me through adulthood. But what it will do is subconsciously start shaping how you think about yourself, how you think about the world and other people. And then that as an adult can come out in day-to-day behaviours and thought processes like, oh, I'm not good enough, or I'm not going to apply for that job because I don't think I'm worth it, or I'm not going to pursue that relationship because they won't love me anyway. So the early experiences we have do fuel our current thought processes and current behaviours. And sometimes that can be a bit of a misconception with cognitive behavioural therapy. Sometimes people will think, oh, well, it's just a sticking plaster. It doesn't really address the underlying issue. But actually, it is very accepted that our experiences when we're younger influence our beliefs and the way we think about ourselves. If you imagine someone who, I don't know, who's got a parent, carers, two parents who believe that the world is dangerous and they want to protect their child as much as they can, and they don't want to expose them to any kind of difficulty, and they don't want to expose them to anything bad that goes on, and the child is told, you need to be really careful, people are bad, people aren't trustworthy. Then if a child is constantly given that messaging, it is a possibility, and perhaps a sort of an increased possibility, that child will grow up with maybe some more anxiety about the world being dangerous, about people being untrustworthy. Maybe they will have a more sceptical streak to their personality than the next person. Maybe they'll be more suspicious of people's motives, because how can you be brought up being told that the world is dangerous, it's full of bad people, bad can happen at any moment, you must do what you can to keep yourself safe, and that not have an influence on how you function as an adult. So it's not just messages about ourselves, but indeed messages that we have when we're younger will influence how we view the world around us as we're older. Now, these things aren't bad things, but what it does is it gives you self-awareness. And self-awareness means you can think, okay, I know where these thought processes come from. I know why I'm behaving the way I am, but actually I don't need to be doing that now. I'm an adult. I'm grown up. I have a very different experience of the world or of relationships, or I want to look for evidence that disproves my historical experience or what I've been told, and I'm going to act against my fundamental ways of thinking and desires to behave. That's how we can help ourselves, having the self-awareness of what early experiences have fueled certain personality or behavioural traits, and you can think about how well they serve you now, and whether or not you could do with loosening the reins on those a little bit and challenging yourself to not behave in a way you've been conditioned to behave, or indeed a way you've been conditioned to think. There are certain thought processes in cognitive behavioural therapy that are viewed as unhealthy, and there are certain thought processes viewed as healthy. They are not to be confused with positive thinking. I'm not saying, okay, on one hand, tell yourself everything in the world is bad, and on the other hand, tell yourself everything is really good. But there are certain ways of thinking that lend themselves to experiencing things in a more unhealthy way. In cognitive behavioural therapy, we talk about healthy negative emotions. A healthy negative emotions could be sadness. Sadness at the loss of a relationship. Mourning the loss of something that you really wanted. It could be experiencing healthy envy, where someone has something you really want. It could be experiencing a healthy level of concern, where you're a bit worried about a new situation. Of course, why wouldn't you be? New situations are unknown, and concern comes from the unknown. But what's unhealthy is when those behaviours lead to you feeling incredibly anxious and wanting to avoid, when they lead to you being so envious. You put down the person who's got the item that you want or the thing that you want, or you end up feeling so overcome with low mood that you disengage with your friends and end up feeling worse. So for every healthy negative emotion, there are unhealthy alternatives as well. But what the aim of cognitive behavioural therapy to do is to help you experience healthy negative responses to negative situations. Now, going back to what I said about unhealthy thinking, there are certain thought processes that really lend themselves to unhealthy feelings and unhealthy behaviours, and I'm going to flag some of them now. Number one is demands. Demands are really rigid, dogmatic ways of thinking. The more rigid and dogmatic you are, the more prone you are to stress. For example, constantly telling yourself, I must achieve, I must do really well, I must never fail at anything, I must never make mistakes, I must always be liked, I must always do what I can to please people. Those things are fine. They're perfectly reasonable thought processes to have, like you want to please people, you don't want to be thought of badly, you want to do well. They're fine, they're understandable. But what's not fine is when you become so rigid and dogmatic about them that you can't cope if you don't achieve those things, that actually you get into a complete tailspin when you fail at something, that you feel like the world is totally against you if someone doesn't like you, that you feel a total failure if you make a mistake. That's not reasonable. And so what you need to do is to be very aware of demands. If you are very rigid and dogmatic in some of the expectations that you have for yourself, you need to try and be a little bit more flexible. Now, some people will say, that's just becoming really passive. That's just not caring. And that's not the case. But what I'm saying to you is if you can be a little more flexible in the expectations you've got of yourself, you will cope far better if you don't meet those expectations, and you'll bounce back more quickly. A very basic example, but I think it makes the point quite well, is if I was very rigid and dogmatic about people littering. If I said, I don't believe people should litter, they must not litter, no matter what. Well, guess what? People litter, irrespective of whether I am very, very dogmatic about it or not. So what happens if I'm very rigid and dogmatic about people littering? I will get incredibly worked up if I see it happening. And that's not good for myself, because I know if I get really worked up, I'm potentially going to take hours to come back down from that. So instead, it's about thinking, I really, really don't want people to litter. I feel very strongly about people not littering, but I can also accept it if they do. Because let's face it, even though there are rules in the world, even though there are laws in the world, people break them. And no matter how rigidly I hold on to a belief that people shouldn't do something, it doesn't mean they won't. So I need to be able to cope when people deviate from how things should, in my mind, be. So instead of being very rigid and dogmatic, try and think in a more flexible, preferential way. I would prefer to be liked by other people. I would really, really like it if I was, but I can accept it if I'm not. Instead of, I must be liked by other people. I must do whatever I can to be accepted by other people. And I must never, ever, ever, no matter what, be thought of badly. The more flexible, preferential way of thinking is going to set you up far more healthily than the rigid, dogmatic way of thinking. Another unhealthy thought process that lends itself to a lot of stress and low mood and potentially anxiety is low frustration tolerance. Those of you who've watched other videos of mine will have heard me mention this in a little bit of detail, but not as much as I'm going to today. Low frustration tolerance is where you tell yourself you simply cannot stand something. And of course, linking back to what I said at the very start about cognitive behavioural therapy being based on the premise that the way you think affects how you feel, of course, if you tell yourself, I cannot stand this, this feels absolutely terrible, this is absolutely awful, then you are going to fuel your belief that you can't cope. And that is not healthy. Low frustration tolerance, where you tell yourself, I simply can't cope, is not a healthy thought process. The healthy alternative to that is what we call high frustration tolerance, where you recognise this is really difficult, but I can cope. I don't like this, but I am able to cope with it. High frustration tolerance is such an important thought process for dealing with stress and for dealing with difficult situations. When you are feeling completely overwhelmed, look out for the low frustration tolerance thinking where you're telling yourself you can't cope. Look out for that, because you need to recognise that telling yourself I can't cope is going to make you feel even worse. Thinking this is really difficult but I can cope is going to help you cope with the situation a lot better. And ultimately, you're going to bounce back from that stressful situation more quickly than if you were to tell yourself you can't cope. Unhealthy thought process number 3 is self-downing. Self-downing is pretty explanatory, isn't it? Pretty self-explanatory. Self-downing is beating yourself up, putting yourself down, telling yourself you're no good. Self-downing is recognised as an unhealthy thought process. Surprise, surprise, because the function of it does nothing other than make you feel bad. If you tell yourself you're no good, that you're useless, that you're worthless, that you're unlovable, all that's going to do is make you feel really bad. And if you feel really bad, you're not going to behave in a healthy way. You're probably going to avoid situations, not have the confidence to try new things, not have the confidence to try and meet new people. So self-downing doesn't serve a purpose. Some people will say, but I'm deserving of beating myself up. I shouldn't think about myself in a particularly decent way. But of course, if you can sort of drill down into what that really is about, that's probably to do with low self-esteem, low confidence. And if you can do things to improve that, then you probably don't have a need to hold on so rigorously to self-downing thoughts. The alternative to self-downing isn't telling yourself you're the best thing since sliced bread. If you want to do that, fine, go ahead, be my guest, tell yourself you're amazing. But the reality is, if you're watching this video and taking some notes on what I'm saying, the chances are you are quite a long way from telling yourself you're the best thing since sliced bread and you're absolutely amazing. What I would encourage you to do is to try and think in a more self-accepting way. I see telling yourself you're amazing on one end of the spectrum, telling yourself you're absolutely useless on another end of the spectrum, and self-acceptance being somewhere in the middle. Self-acceptance is where you can tell yourself, I might not be particularly good at that, I may have made a mistake there, I may have failed at doing X, Y, or Z, but it doesn't mean I'm totally useless, it doesn't mean I'm worthless, it doesn't mean I'm not worthwhile, it simply means I'm fallible. Just because I'm not the best at something, it doesn't mean I'm the worst. It just means I'm human, I'm fallible, I will make mistakes. An occupational hazard of being a human is that you will make mistakes. You will deviate from your ideal. You will do things that aren't particularly amazing. You will make mistakes. You will hurt people, albeit unintentionally. You will fall short of your standards a lot of the time. And we all do. That's part and parcel of being human. That doesn't mean you're useless. It doesn't mean you're no good. It just means you're fallible. So when you find yourself really berating yourself and engaging in self-downing, think about the function of it. How well does it serve you to engage in that thought process? Probably not very well. So instead, try and develop a slightly kinder, more compassionate, self-accepting take on the situation. I often say that a useful thing to do is to think about what you would tell a friend in that situation. What would you be doing to a friend if they were saying they'd failed at something, they'd made a mistake, they'd let someone down, they'd, not behaved in an ideal way? You would presumably assert a level of compassion towards your friend and a level of other acceptance that you wouldn't afford to yourself. But you need to try and bridge the gap between what you're doing for other people and what you would do for yourself. Self-downing is unhealthy. Self-acceptance is healthy. The fourth thought process that I'm going to talk to you about that is unhealthy is awfulizing. Awfulizing is where you rate what you're dealing with as absolutely terrible, absolutely horrific. And of course, if you tell yourself what I'm dealing with is the worst thing ever, what I'm dealing with is totally horrific, you're going to get yourself even more worked up. The reality is most of what we deal with isn't absolutely horrific. But a caveat to this is if you are going to do what I'm now going to say, which is anti-awfulize, which is where you maintain perspective on the severity of the situation, you have to keep it relative to the situation you're dealing with. If people are told to anti-awfulize and to maintain perspective on the severity of a situation, what they will typically do is tell themselves, you're right, I'm so silly. I shouldn't be getting wound up about a silly work situation because there are people in the world who don't have homes. There are people in the world who are living with conflict every day. What am I doing getting stressed about a silly work situation? And actually all that happens when you do that is typically you will end up beating yourself up for being so consumed with trivial issues. But the reality is if you're feeling stressed about a situation, chances are it is a very real negative situation for yourself, irrespective of world atrocities that are going on. So comparing your situation to external stressors often won't help. So instead you need to anti-awfulize relative to what you're dealing with. For example, if someone says to me they are completely overwhelmed with the idea of having to do a presentation at work to their team, I may say, well, how bad is it? And they may say, it's awful. I have social anxiety. I don't like presenting. It's awful. I can't think of anything worse than having to present to my team at work. And I'll say, okay, well, what would it be like then if you had to present to your entire department? And suddenly that person will say, okay, well, presenting to my team was 100 out of 100 for difficulty, but actually that's less in comparison to doing it in front of the department. Doing it in front of the department will be even worse. Now, that's not to say that doing it in front of someone's team isn't bad. It is, but actually what the person would be able to do is say, okay, it's bad, but not awful. And that's the thought process we're looking for here. The anti-awfulizing thought process is, this is bad, but it isn't absolutely awful. And by recognising something is bad but not awful, you automatically calm your system down a little bit. You calm your system down a little bit, and that will then trigger the thought process is like, okay, this is difficult, but I can cope. So try and anti-awfulize relative to what you're dealing with. If you've been rejected by someone, it's a case of thinking, okay, it's bad that I got rejected by them, but at least I haven't been rejected by everyone in my life. Or actually, if it feels as if you have been rejected by everyone in your life, then you need to think about, well, that doesn't mean I'm going to be rejected by everyone in the future as well. So you've just got to try and maintain perspective relative to what you are dealing with. It will help, and it will put you in better stead for dealing with stressful situations. Now, I've mentioned 4 unhealthy thought processes, and they're 4 healthy alternatives. So you've got demands, and the healthy alternative is preferences and flexible thinking. You've got low frustration tolerance, which is where you tell yourself you can't cope with the situation, versus high frustration tolerance, which is where you recognise this is difficult, but I can cope. You've got self-downing, which is where you beat yourself up and put yourself down, versus self-acceptance, which is where you develop a more accepting way of thinking about yourself. And then you've got awfulizing, which is where you tell yourself, this is absolutely awful, it's the worst thing I could be dealing with, versus anti-awfulizing, which is where you think, okay, this is bad, but it isn't absolutely awful. From a cognitive behavioural therapy perspective, they are some of your thoughts. They are some of the thoughts that we are looking to challenge, to try and move you away from experiencing really unhealthy negative emotions into healthier negative responses. And to do that, you've got to change the way you think. So try really hard to recognise those 4 thought processes I've told you about and develop the healthier alternatives. Now, I've spoken about some of the thought processes that come with cognitive behavioural therapy. Of course, I've given you the cognitive part, but I'm also going to talk about behaviours, because changing the way you think alone is not going to change how you feel. You also need to change your behaviours. If, for example, someone is experiencing a really low mood, say they're depressed, and they spend a long time trying to change how they think, and they're able to think, okay, just because I've had a depressive episode, it doesn't mean I'm a bad person, it doesn't mean I'm a failure, it just means I'm fallible, it means I'm unwell, it means that I'm, a perfectly worthy human. If someone just focuses on changing their thought processes, but doesn't then change their behaviours, and for example, in this situation, they just stay in bed, nothing will change. They will continue to feel incredibly depressed. So what we're looking at is changing your thought processes and changing your behaviours. So behaviours that are unhealthy are behaviours that are typically not serving you well in the long run. You need to think, okay, if I carried on this behaviour day in, day out, or week in, week out, month in, month out, for years, how well would that serve me? That's what we would call a pragmatic challenge to your behaviours. And if you recognise that actually the behaviour you're engaging with is unhealthy, because in the long run it's not going to serve you particularly well, then you need to change it. A lot of the time people engage in behaviours that are unhealthy because they're comforting in the short term. Think about compulsive eating or comfort eating. It gives comfort in the short term. Think about someone who's socially anxious and wants to avoid a situation. It gives them some temporary relief because they can avoid a challenging situation. Think about someone who's depressed, who stays in bed. That gives them temporary relief because they're able to shut off from the world. But actually, those 3 behaviours and so many more are unhealthy, because the person who continually engages in comfort eating, or the person who avoids situations because of their anxiety, or the person who stays in bed because of their low mood, actually all those behaviours are just going to make the problem worse and ultimately make how you feel, whether it's bad about yourself or anxious or low in mood, they're going to make you feel even worse. So it's a case of trying to challenge those behaviours. Now, Rome was not built in a day. We are not looking at you changing your entire life overnight. It is simply a case of you thinking, what are some of the small behaviours that I need to change in order to improve things? If you're not leaving the house, for example, not telling yourself I need to run 10k tomorrow morning, but saying tomorrow morning I need to go to the end of the road and back again. I need to leave the house every day. For someone who's really anxious, it's not about saying I've got to throw myself into all the party invitations that may come to me, or all the social events at work, but it is thinking, what can I do to challenge myself a little bit? For the person who engages in excessive comfort eating, it might be a case of thinking, what can I do to sort of rein myself in slightly? Would I be able to put away 1 biscuit instead of eating the 13th, 14th, 15th one? Could I leave the 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th packet of crisps? It's making small progress, because by making small progress, you will lead yourself into a better situation to make bigger changes. It's small progress. Think about the micro behaviours that you can change that will help you behave in a healthier way in the long run. Don't beat yourself up about engaging in these behaviours. It's totally normal, but also it's unhealthy and it needs to be addressed. Unhealthy behaviours typically appear with certain emotions. There are certain behaviours that appear with certain emotions. For example, if someone is anxious, they are likely to avoid. If someone's depressed, they're likely to socially isolate. If someone is really angry, they are likely to engage in outbursts or passive aggression, sarcasm. If someone is really unhealthily envious, then they are likely to put down the item that they desire. If someone is experiencing an intensely negative episode and they're feeling really sad, they might engage in behaviours that actually perpetuate the sadness. So it's about thinking, what's the main emotion that I'm feeling, and what are the behaviours that are sort of playing out as a result of how I'm feeling, and therefore how can I tweak them slightly. As a general rule of thumb, if you are feeling bad, irrespective of the emotion that is driving you feeling bad, you need to do what you can to act against your natural inclination. It could be argued that human beings have a propensity towards irrationality, and actually, when we feel bad, the behaviours that we lean towards aren't going to be the ones that serve us particularly well. So recognise that it's totally understandable that you're doing that. We're all wired to want to seek the short-term comfort, but it's not serving you well. So try and make the small changes. Making small changes is what leads to the bigger changes. And by changing your behaviours and by changing your thought processes, you're entering into the world of CBT, and you are making healthier changes to experience healthier outcomes. A good way of thinking is a good way of working out if what you're thinking or behaving like is healthy is to think, how well is this serving me? How well is this behaviour serving me? Or indeed, how well is this thought process serving me? For example, how well is it serving you beating yourself up the whole time? What is the function of that? Is it going to get you towards your goals? If you're thinking, I simply can't cope with this, this is too overwhelming, how well does that serve you? Does thinking like that serve a purpose? If it doesn't, then you really need to try very hard to create an alternative to that. It's what we call the pragmatic argument. How well is that serving you? Another question to ask yourself is what I'm telling myself logical? Is the way I'm behaving logical? And if it's not, again, it's another warning sign that you could do with trying to change what you're doing or trying to change how you're thinking. And the final thing to think about is what I'm telling myself true? Is it empirically true? Could a scientist come in and prove what I'm telling myself to be really accurate? For example, if you're self-downing, is it empirically true that you're completely worthless? Absolutely not. You simply cannot say that your entire being is worthless. We're far too complex as human beings to rate ourselves as one thing. Is it empirically true that you simply can't cope with a situation? No, we simply don't spontaneously combust when we're dealing with difficulty. So try and engage in what we call disputations. Is what you're doing or telling yourself logical? Is what you're doing or telling yourself practical? Is what you're doing or telling yourself empirically true? Could it be proved? And if you answer no to those questions, then you need to think, okay, what can I do to change this? Cognitive behavioural therapy isn't something that transforms people's lives overnight. Neither is it a magic cure that means you don't need to put in hard work. Cognitive behavioural therapy is simply changing thoughts and behaviours bit by bit to experience healthier negative outcomes. But a big part of cognitive behavioural therapy is learning to become your own therapist. The idea isn't that you engage in lots and lots of help with a therapist so they can get you on the path of recovery and stay with you forever and a day. The idea is you learn to be your own therapist. And that's why learning some of the valuable techniques of cognitive behavioural therapy can be a really, really good starting point and indeed continuation point for you to apply those principles for your own recovery. If you have any questions about what I said, feel free to comment in the comments box and I will answer with how the theory can be applied to your situation. If you've enjoyed today's video, hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, give feedback on what you would like to hear more of, and I will be sure to give you plenty more tips on how you can use psychology in your day-to-day life.